On the ruined world of Vecra 7, Commander Sirika Vel crouched low behind the shattered wall of what had once been a grand human city. The streets were now a desolate wasteland, littered with the remnants of old war machines, burnt-out buildings, and the wreckage of lives lost in the conflict. She was silent, her piercing golden eyes scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of movement. The Terran resistance had been a thorn in the side of the Kari Dominion for years, but Captain Rylan Voss, the leader of the resistance forces, had become the face of their rebellion. The Kari had been chasing him across the stars for months, and now, on this forsaken planet, she had finally tracked him down. Sirika was no ordinary soldier. She was the Kari's finest, genetically engineered for precision and brutality. Her tall frame was lean but strong, her skin a pale gray with a slight metallic sheen that marked her as one of her kind. Her long black hair flowed like a shadow down her back, a symbol of the deadly efficiency she carried with every mission. She was meant to be a weapon, sharp, calculated, and unfeeling. But Rylan Voss was different. The moment she first heard his voice over Kari communication channels, she felt an unfamiliar sense of tension. There was something in his tone, something in his words that stirred a feeling she had long buried. She dismissed it at first as weakness, something the Terrans were known for. But now, as she crouched in the ruins of this city, her breath steady as she awaited her target's arrival, that strange feeling nagged at the back of her mind. Suddenly, the sound of boots crunching on gravel reached her ears. She tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the blade at her side. There he was, Captain Rylan Voss, emerging from behind a half-destroyed building. He was tall, with dark, unkempt hair and the rugged, weathered look of someone who had been fighting for far too long. His face was scared from battle, his eyes sharp and full of defiance. He wore the mark of the Terran resistance, a simple yet worn black uniform that told the world he wasn't just a soldier, he was their leader. His gaze swept over the ruined streets, his eyes narrowing as they fell on Sirika's position. For a moment, they stared at each other across the battlefield, two warriors locked in an unspoken understanding. Sirika's heart skipped a beat. She had been trained to kill without hesitation. But now, standing in front of this human, she felt something. Something unexpected. It wasn't fear. It wasn't weakness. It was something deeper. Rylan didn't flinch. Instead, he gave her a small, almost mocking smile. "So, you're the Kari's best," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I've heard rumors. But you don't look so tough." Sirika's hand tightened on the hilt of her blade. She couldn't afford distractions. She couldn't let this human get under her skin. With a single, fluid motion, she stood up and aimed her blaster at him. "You'll find out soon enough, Terran," she replied coldly. "This is where your rebellion ends." Ryland's smile didn't fade. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I doubt it," he said softly. "But let's find out." Sirika's fingers twitched on the trigger, but she hesitated. She couldn't understand why. This was her mission. This was her duty. Yet, for the first time in her life, she couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger. And that's when she realized. This was not just another kill. This was the moment everything would change. Sirika's finger lingered on the trigger of her blaster, the weight of the weapon suddenly feeling like an anchor around her wrist. She should have fired by now. She should have ended this. But the words Rylan spoke echoed in her mind, unsettling her with their calm confidence. She had been trained to never hesitate, to follow her orders without question. And yet, standing before this human, she found herself frozen in place. Rylan's eyes, sharp and observant, studied her closely. His hands were raised slightly in mock surrender, but there was a challenge in his stance, an unwavering belief that he could talk his way out of this. "You've got the gun, Commander," he said, his voice steady despite the tension thickening in the air. "But you're not pulling the trigger. That says something." Sirika's lips tightened, but her resolve wavered. He was right. She had all the power in this moment. She had the training, the experience, the deadly skills to bring him down in an instant. And yet here she was, hesitating. Why? Your mission is simple, Ryland continued, his gaze never leaving hers. You're supposed to eliminate the resistance leader. That's me. His lips twitched into a slight grin, and for a moment, he almost seemed amused. But I'm guessing you already know that's not what this is about, is it? The words felt like a punch to her chest. How did he know? She had never let anyone see through her so easily. But somehow, this human, this captain, saw something she herself couldn't understand. Something was happening here, something that went beyond orders and military objectives. Sirika shook her head, her mind racing. She had to finish this. She couldn't afford to think about his words. Her training told her one thing: kill him now, before he could become a bigger threat. But the nagging feeling in her chest was growing louder, urging her to stop. Without warning, Ryland took a slow step forward. His eyes softened, but there was no fear, no hesitation in his movements. I'm not the enemy you think I am, he said quietly. At least, not in the way you've been told. We've never wanted to destroy everything you stand for. We've wanted to survive. Sirika's grip on her blaster tightened, her knuckles white with tension. He was lying. That's what her training told her. The Kari Dominion had been at war with humanity for decades, and the Terran resistance had been the enemy since the beginning. But something in his voice, a flicker of truth, made her doubt everything she had been taught. You don't understand, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The weight of her mission pressed down on her like a boulder. The Kari will never stop. We are the future. We were made for this, made to conquer, to lead, to rule. Ryland's expression softened even further, as if he were speaking to someone who didn't understand the full picture. But you're wrong, Commander. We've all been lied to, every single one of us. The Kari, the Terrans, none of this had to happen. But we've been taught to hate each other. Sirika's mind was in turmoil. What if he was right? What if the Kari Dominion, the very empire she had pledged her loyalty to, wasn't the righteous cause she believed it to be? She wanted to push the thought away, to silence the doubt, but she couldn't. The more Ryland spoke, the more she wondered if there was more to this war than just orders and conquest. Before she could respond, a sudden noise from behind them interrupted the tense moment. Sirika whirled, her blaster raised again, her instincts kicking in. But Ryland didn't flinch. We're not alone, he said quietly. Sirika's heart raced as she scanned the area, her mind snapping back into soldier mode. Whatever was happening between them had to wait. Survival came first. She was still a hunter. Ryland was still the prey. But a part of her, an unsettling part, was beginning to wonder if that was the only truth left. The noise grew louder, drawing Sirika's attention back to the present danger. Her instincts kicked in immediately. With a swift motion, she pressed her back against the shattered wall, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Ryland, still standing a few paces away, did the same, his posture shifting into one of readiness. They were no longer enemies in that moment. They were two soldiers caught in the same fight for survival. Sirika had been trained to never let her guard down, especially not around humans. Yet here she was, standing beside one, her target, and she was allowing him to remain alive longer than necessary. Her mind screamed at her to focus, to act. But the strange tension between them, the questions, the doubts, still lingered. She could feel it in her chest, a tightness that made it harder to breathe. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Sirika's eyes flicked to Ryland, silently warning him to stay quiet. But Ryland wasn't afraid. He moved with quiet precision, his every step calculated. It was clear now that he was no ordinary human soldier. He was more than a leader of the resistance. He was a fighter, just like her, someone who had learned to survive in a universe that showed no mercy. From the corner of her eye, Sirika saw movement. Shadows flitted between the broken buildings ahead. Kari soldiers, moving in formation. They must have tracked her signal, or perhaps they had followed Ryland's trail. Either way, she didn't have much time. "We have to move," Sirika whispered, her voice a low hiss, her hand still gripping her blaster. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, but there was no choice now. They needed to work together, if only for the moment. Ryland's eyes met hers, a brief flicker of understanding passing between them. "Lead the way," he said, his voice calm but serious. Without another word, Sirika sprinted to the next broken structure, her movements fluid and quick. Ryland followed her closely, keeping up with the same swift pace, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. They were a strange pair, one from the Kari, trained to kill without hesitation, the other from the Terran resistance, fighting for freedom and survival. They had nothing in common, yet in this moment, they were forced to rely on each other. As they moved through the crumbling streets, Sirika's mind was torn between the need to survive and the strange pull of uncertainty. She had spent her life training to fight the humans, to see them as the enemy, as a race weak and fractured, easy to control. But Ryland's resilience, his calm in the face of danger, it was like nothing she had ever seen before. And now, standing side by side, she realized something unsettling. This wasn't just about war. It wasn't just about orders. There was something else, something deeper. Ryland's refusal to back down wasn't out of stubbornness or arrogance. It was because he believed in something worth fighting for. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her back to reality. She pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the mission at hand. They had to escape. There would be time for answers later, if they both survived. Sirika's heart raced as she ducked behind a piece of debris, peering around the corner. The Kari soldiers were getting closer. She could hear them speaking in their native tongue, their voices harsh and mechanical. Ryland pressed against the wall beside her, his hand briefly brushing hers. For a split second, she felt the warmth of his touch, a strange contrast to the cold metal of her own weapons. She quickly pulled away, but not before she noticed the glint of determination in his eyes. He wasn't just going to run. He was going to fight. "We need a plan," Ryland whispered urgently, his voice steady despite the danger closing in around them. Sirika's mind raced. She had always been the one with the plan. But now, as she looked at him, she realized that this was no longer just her mission. This was their fight. Together. Her lips tightened into a grim smile. "Let's give them a reason to regret chasing us." Sirika's heart was pounding in her chest as she and Ryland crouched in the shadows of the ruined building, the sound of Kari soldiers growing ever closer. The tension in the air was thick, but Sirika's mind was clear. She was trained for moments like this, calm, focused, and deadly. But with Ryland by her side, it felt different. She was used to acting alone, to relying on nothing but her skills and her instincts. But now, as they prepared to face the enemy together, she couldn't ignore the flicker of doubt in her mind. Could she really trust him? Could she work with him, knowing everything he stood for was the opposite of what she had been taught to believe? Ryland wasn't waiting for an answer to those questions. He was already moving, his face set in determination. He turned to Sirika, his voice low. "We need to move quickly. We can't stay here." Without a word, Sirika nodded. She motioned for him to follow as she led the way, weaving through the rubble, her footsteps silent on the cracked ground. They moved like ghosts, slipping through the shadows, their bodies low to avoid detection. As they turned a corner, Sirika signaled for a brief pause, her sharp eyes scanning the area. The Kari soldiers were close now, too close. She could hear their mechanical voices, their footsteps heavy and deliberate as they searched the area. Ryland's voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. "You said we give them a reason to regret chasing us." His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet excitement that Sirika couldn't ignore. She glanced back at him, a grim smile pulling at her lips. "Don't worry," she muttered. "I have a plan." She reached into the small pouch at her waist and pulled out a small device, an explosive charge. She held it up, her fingers deftly working to set the timer. Ryland watched her, his gaze steady. "How much time do we have?" Not long, she replied, slipping the charge into a narrow gap in the building's crumbling wall. But it'll be enough. She stood up, her eyes quickly scanning for the nearest exit. They had to move fast. The explosion was deafening. It ripped through the building with a violent force, sending debris flying in all directions. Sirika and Raylan darted for cover, their bodies instinctively ducking as the shockwave shook the ground beneath them. As the dust began to settle, the Kari soldiers were momentarily stunned, their attention diverted by the blast. It was the perfect distraction. Sirika's pulse raced with adrenaline as she motioned for Raylan to move. They sprinted toward the edge of the building, taking advantage of the chaos. As they dashed into the open, the Kari soldiers quickly regained their composure and began firing in their direction. But Sirika was already ahead, moving with the speed and precision of a predator. She ducked behind a pillar, Raylan right behind her. "Now we fight," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was still hammering in her chest. Raylan grinned, the same determined smile from before. "I thought you'd never ask." Together, they turned and launched into action. Sirika's blaster was quick to respond, her aim sharp as she took out the first soldier in their path. The Kari armor was strong, but it wasn't invincible. Raylan moved beside her, his own weapon raised as he returned fire. The sounds of battle echoed around them, but Sirika felt a strange sense of clarity in the chaos. For the first time, she wasn't just following orders. She was fighting for something bigger than the war she had been told to fight. And for some reason, with Raylan beside her, it felt like they might just have a chance. The Kari soldiers fell one by one, their assault faltering under the precision of Sirika and Raylan's combined fire. They moved as one, their partnership smooth and deadly. As the last soldier dropped to the ground, Sirika and Raylan stood still for a moment, catching their breath. The silence that followed felt strange, almost surreal. Sirika glanced at Raylan, her expression unreadable. "You're good, Terran." Raylan chuckled, lowering his weapon. "I've had practice." She nodded, a hint of respect in her eyes. "Let's keep moving." Sirika's breath came in quick, steady bursts as she and Raylan moved further into the wreckage of the city. The Kari soldiers had been dealt with, but their presence wasn't the only danger lurking. The atmosphere on Vecra 7 was thick with tension, the remains of the human city casting long shadows over them. The deeper they went into the ruins, the more the air seemed to press down on them. Raylan moved beside her, his posture alert, eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Sirika, ever the warrior, didn't let her guard slip for a second. But the quiet between them, the adrenaline fading, was starting to feel different. Not uncomfortable, but unsettling. She had fought alongside others in battle before, but with Raylan, it felt as though there was something more at stake. "You know," Raylan said suddenly, his voice low, "if we make it out of here, I'll owe you a drink." Sirika's lips twitched. "A drink? I didn't think Terrans were known for their hospitality." She kept her eyes ahead, though there was a flicker of curiosity in her expression. Why was he making light of this? After everything they'd just been through, Raylan was still making jokes. But the sound of his voice, calm and sure, almost gave her a sense of hope. She hated to admit it, but for the first time since she had met him, she wanted to hear more of what he had to say. Raylan's grin was quick, though it faded into something more serious. "You'd be surprised. There's more to us than just fighting, you know." He looked over at her, his eyes thoughtful. "And you're different from the others I've fought. You don't seem like you're here just because of orders." Sirika froze for a moment, a chill running down her spine. She knew what he meant. She had always been just a soldier. Her loyalty was to the Kari Dominion, to the higher command, to the mission. Everything she had done in her life had been dictated by duty. But Raylan had a way of making her question things. The words she had been trained to believe, the world she had been taught to fight for. She had never questioned the Kari. But now, standing here, she wasn't so sure. "You don't know anything about me, Terran," she said quickly, her voice a little sharper than she intended. Rylan didn't flinch. Instead, he turned to face her, his expression softening. I know enough. You're not like them. You don't have to be. Sirika's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to believe she was nothing more than a weapon, that the Kari Dominion's mission was the only path she had. But there was a part of her, a small voice deep inside, that wondered if he was right. What if there was more to her than just the role she had been given? Don't make this harder than it already is, she muttered, turning her gaze back to the path ahead. Her hand tightened around the hilt of her blade, a reminder of who she was supposed to be. They continued to move, the silence growing between them, the weight of the unspoken words heavy in the air. The further they traveled, the more they encountered remnants of the battle, the burned-out husks of Terran vehicles, the scattered debris of war. It was clear that this city had seen its fair share of destruction, and Sirika couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. As they rounded a corner, a loud crash echoed from nearby. Sirika's instincts kicked in immediately. She signaled for Rylan to take cover, and they both ducked into an abandoned structure, just as a group of Kari patrols appeared on the horizon. They weren't alone anymore. The Kari had been tracking them again. Sirika felt her heart race. There was no turning back now. The battle was far from over. But she wasn't the same soldier she had been before. And she wasn't facing this fight alone. Rylan, the Terran rebel, was beside her, perhaps even more than that. Together, they were the perfect combination of skill and survival. And maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide of this war. Get ready, Sirika said, her voice cold and determined once more. She had a plan. It was time to see it through. Sirika's pulse quickened as the Kari patrols drew closer, their heavy footsteps thudding in rhythm. She could hear their voices, the metallic hum of their communication devices crackling through the air. She glanced over at Rylan, his face set with grim determination, and felt an unexpected rush of confidence. Together, they could make it through this. The old building they were hiding in had once been part of a bustling human district, but now it was just another hollow shell of war. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, and the floor covered in dust and debris. But it was still good cover. For now, it was enough. Sirika crouched low, her hand resting on the weapon at her side, her mind calculating every possible move. They needed to make it past the patrols, but there was no easy way out. She'd need a diversion. Something big enough to draw their attention away, long enough for them to slip by. Rylan's voice cut through her thoughts. We don't have much time. What's the plan? His eyes were sharp, waiting for her command. Sirika took a deep breath, her mind working rapidly. We'll have to split up, she said. I'll go left, you take right. I'll set a trap, something to keep them occupied. You move fast, take out anyone in your way. We don't stop until we're through. Rylan nodded, his expression serious. I'm with you. Sirika's fingers tightened around the handle of her blaster. For a moment, she wondered if this was a mistake, splitting up in enemy territory, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. It was their best shot. The Kari patrols were almost upon them now, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. Sirika made her move, ducking into the shadows and moving swiftly to the side. She had prepared a small explosive charge earlier, one she had placed near the entrance of the building. It wasn't much, just enough to create a distraction, but it would be enough to give them the opening they needed. She crouched beside the charge, adjusting the timer, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and she could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She was breaking every rule she had ever followed. She was betraying her own people. But with each step, each movement, the weight grew lighter. She was finally beginning to understand. Perhaps there was something more to this fight. The timer was set. She stood and sprinted to the opposite side of the building, where Rylan was already positioned. He gave her a brief nod, his gaze never leaving the patrols. On your mark, Sirica whispered, her breath steady despite the chaos brewing around them. Now, Rylan replied, his voice barely audible. The explosion was sudden and deafening. A burst of light and sound filled the air, throwing the Kari soldiers into confusion. Sirica watched as the patrols scattered, their attention completely diverted. It was their chance. She sprinted forward, her legs moving faster than she had ever run before. Behind her, Rylan was right on her heels, his movements just as fluid and fast. The two of them moved like a single unit, a force of nature unleashed on the battlefield. As they neared the edge of the building, Sirica glanced back, spotting a Kari soldier aiming at them. Without thinking, she swung around, firing in a smooth motion. The soldier collapsed, his weapon falling to the ground with a thud. Rylan was already ahead of her, clearing the way. He turned back briefly, giving her a brief smile. Not bad for a Kari. Sirica shot him a look but couldn't suppress the smirk that tugged at her lips. For the first time since this mission began, she felt something more than just duty. She felt alive. They pushed forward, the wreckage of the city blurring around them. With every step, they were closer to the heart of the resistance, closer to the answers Sirica had been seeking. The Kari Dominion had lied to her, used her, but Rylan, the Terran rebel, had shown her a different path, one that was still full of danger, but also full of hope. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time, Sirica wasn't walking it alone. And that made all the difference. The ground trembled beneath Sirica's boots as she and Rylan sprinted through the wreckage of what had once been a thriving city. The explosion they had set off had bought them precious moments, but they couldn't afford to waste any more time. Behind them, the Kari patrols were regrouping, their pursuit relentless. They knew they couldn't outrun them forever, but they had to keep pushing forward. Rylan was silent beside her, his breathing steady, his eyes scanning the area. The further they moved from the city center, the more the terrain became treacherous. Broken buildings and debris filled the streets, making it hard to find a clear path. But Sirica wasn't bothered by the obstacles. She had lived her whole life in war zones, navigating through chaos. The real challenge was what lay ahead, getting to the hidden resistance base, the last chance for humanity's survival on Vecra 7. I can feel them closing in, Rylan said suddenly, his voice low but urgent. Sirica nodded without looking at him. She could hear it too, the faint sound of Kari vehicles rumbling in the distance, their engines humming steadily as they searched the streets. It wouldn't be long before the patrols were on top of them again. She glanced at Rylan, who was now pulling something from his jacket, a small device with blinking lights. "What is that?" she asked, her voice curious despite the tension. "A tracker," he said, his hands working quickly to conceal it. "If we can get close enough to the resistance base, we'll be able to signal them. They can help us from there." Sirica's eyes narrowed, considering his words. "You think they'll help us?" She couldn't stop herself from asking. Rylan didn't look at her as he tucked the device into his belt. "They don't have a choice. This is bigger than any of us." He paused, then added, "Besides, I trust them." Sirica couldn't help the small flicker of doubt that passed through her. Trust. It wasn't a word she was used to, especially when it came to humans. She had been trained to see them as nothing more than obstacles to the Kari Dominion's plans. But there was something about Rylan, a quiet strength, an unwavering belief in his cause, that made her question everything she had been taught. The sound of approaching vehicles snapped her out of her thoughts. They didn't have much time. "We need to move," she said, her voice all business once again. She turned, signaling for Rylan to follow as she darted to the side, weaving through the ruins in search of cover. They had to reach the resistance base before the Kari found them again. Every minute they spent in the open was a risk, and Sirica knew they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They reached an alleyway, narrow and littered with debris, and crouched behind a large piece of wreckage. From here, they had a clear view of the street where the Kari vehicles were moving. They were getting closer, their searchlights sweeping across the landscape as they advanced. Ryland's eyes were fixed on the lights, his jaw clenched. "We can't stay here much longer." Sirika's hand tightened around the handle of her blaster. "I know," she muttered, her voice low. "We'll have to make a break for it." Ryland nodded, his face determined. He trusted her, trusted them, and that trust gave her a strange sense of responsibility. They were in this together now, their fates intertwined. They waited, the seconds dragging by, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, when the time was right, Sirika gave the signal. They moved quickly, darting from one piece of cover to the next, staying low, staying silent. Their goal was clear. The resistance base was their only hope. But getting there alive was going to take everything they had. As they neared the final stretch of open ground, Sirika could feel her heart pounding in her chest. They were almost there. They could hear the distant hum of the Resistance's hidden signal, calling them home. But the Kari were closing in fast. They were out of time. Ryland caught her gaze for a brief moment, a silent understanding passing between them. They would make it or they wouldn't. But together, they were stronger than they had been alone. The first Kari vehicle rounded the corner, its searchlight blinding. Sirika raised her weapon, preparing for the fight ahead. The Kari vehicle came closer, its searchlight sweeping across the open ground where Sirika and Ryland were crouched. Every second felt like an eternity as they huddled behind the debris, holding their breath, praying they wouldn't be spotted. The soft hum of the vehicle's engine was the only sound, growing louder and louder as it neared their position. Ryland's eyes flicked to Sirika, a silent question in his gaze. She nodded slightly, signaling for him to stay still. The light passed over them once, twice, but it didn't stop. For a moment, Sirika felt a rush of relief, but she knew better than to trust it. The Kari were relentless. It wasn't over yet. She motioned for Ryland to move forward, her fingers barely brushing against his arm. He understood immediately, and together, they slipped into the shadow of another broken building. They moved quickly, their feet barely making a sound on the rubble-strewn ground. Every few steps, Sirika would stop and listen, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of danger. The Kari were still close behind, their presence like a shadow that never quite left them. But the resistance base was near, just over the hill. They could make it if they stayed quiet, stayed hidden. It was their only chance. Almost there, Ryland whispered, his voice tight with urgency. "Stay sharp." Sirika nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The plan was simple. Reach the base, signal for help, and get out of the open before the Kari caught up. She had faced danger before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher now, and Ryland wasn't just another ally. He was a reminder of everything she had been questioning. Humanity wasn't the enemy. The Kari Dominion had lied to her, used her for their own agenda. But now, with Ryland beside her, she could see the truth. They were fighting for the same thing: freedom, survival, hope. As they crept closer to the base, Sirika's thoughts flickered back to her past. The years spent as a soldier, following orders without question. The countless battles, the lives lost. She had never thought to question the cause she fought for, but Ryland had opened her eyes. He had shown her that there was more to the story, more to life than just fighting for an empire that saw her as nothing more than a tool. "Get ready," Sirika muttered, snapping herself back to the present. They were almost at the base now, the signals from the hidden resistance growing stronger with every step. But just as they reached the final stretch of ground, a low growl rumbled in the distance. Sirika's instincts flared. "Get down," she hissed. They dove behind a pile of twisted metal as a second Kari vehicle appeared, its lights flashing brightly in the night. The soldiers inside were scanning the area, their search widening. It was too close, too dangerous. Ryland looked at her, eyes wide with urgency. "We're running out of time." Sirika's mind raced. They couldn't wait here forever, but charging straight for the base was just as risky. She needed to make a decision. Fast. In that moment, she saw the faint glow of the resistance signal. just a few meters ahead. It was their beacon, their lifeline. Without it, they were dead. With a steady breath, Surika made up her mind. "We make a break for it," she said, her voice cold with determination. "On my mark." Rylan nodded. "Ready." "Ready." The moment the Kari vehicle turned away, Surika shot to her feet, sprinting toward the base with Rylan right behind her. They were fast, faster than the Kari could react. As they neared the entrance, Surika punched in the code on a small panel, her fingers moving quickly. The gate slid open just as the Kari vehicle turned back toward them, its engines roaring. "Go!" Surika shouted, pushing Rylan through the gate just in time. They dove inside, panting, hearts racing as the massive door slammed shut behind them. For a moment, they were safe, out of sight, out of danger. But they both knew this wasn't over. The Kari would keep hunting them, but for now, they had a chance. Rylan turned to Surika, a grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. "We made it." Surika didn't smile, but she nodded. "We did." Inside the resistance base, the air was heavy with tension, but there was also a sense of relief. Surika and Rylan stood at the entrance, panting from their harrowing escape, as the massive gate sealed shut behind them. They had made it. For now. The base was a hidden fortress, built into the very heart of the planet's rugged terrain. There were no windows, just walls of reinforced metal, and the hum of machinery in the background. It was a safe house, a sanctuary for those who fought against the Kari Dominion. Rylan turned to Surika, his expression softening for the first time since they'd entered the base. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Surika didn't respond immediately. Instead, she scanned their surroundings, taking in the faces of the few resistance fighters who were already at work, moving quickly but efficiently, preparing for the next battle. The quiet hum of the base contrasted sharply with the chaos they had just left behind. "We need to report in," she said finally, her tone steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She was beginning to realize how much this moment meant. She had walked away from everything she had once known, everything she had been taught to believe. And now, with the resistance, she was truly free to make her own choices. Rylan nodded. "Yeah, but I think we deserve a minute first." That was close. Surika allowed herself a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. The mission wasn't over yet. They still had to destroy the Kari Dominion's hold on Vecra 7, and that meant more danger, more sacrifices. But at least now, they had the chance to fight back. They moved toward a central command area, where a figure stepped forward to greet them. A tall, broad-shouldered man with dark eyes and a serious expression. He was the leader of this particular resistance cell, a veteran fighter named Commander Lyros. His reputation preceded him, a man who had seen too many battles, but never gave up. "So, you two made it," Commander Lyros said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "I've heard the rumors. The Kari won't stop coming for you, Surika. They've marked you as a traitor." Surika straightened, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not a traitor. I'm a soldier who woke up." Lyros gave her a small nod of approval, as if he understood the weight of her words. "Good. We need soldiers like you." He turned to Rylan, his expression shifting to one of respect. "And you," Lyros said, "you've done well. We knew the Terrans were resourceful, but I didn't expect this level of skill." Rylan grinned, clearly pleased. "I learned from the best." The two exchanged a brief look, and for a moment, Surika saw something in Rylan's eyes, an unspoken connection. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something more, a shared purpose. "Get some rest," Lyros said, breaking the silence. "We move out in 3 hours. We'll hit their supply lines, take out their reinforcements. The Kari are starting to lose control here, and it's time to finish what we started." Surika nodded. "Understood." As she and Rylan walked away from the command area, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something far greater than they had anticipated. The fight for Vecra 7 wasn't just about taking down an enemy. It was about reclaiming a world, a future, and a sense of identity that had been stolen from them both. Rylan glanced at her, his eyes thoughtful. What now? Sirika hesitated for a moment before answering. Now we fight, together. They both knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but for the first time in a long while, Sirika felt something she hadn't expected to find. Hope. Hope that they could win. Hope that they could make a difference. The Kari Dominion had underestimated humanity, and now they were going to pay for it. And no matter what came next, Sirika knew that she and Rylan were ready for whatever the future held. They weren't alone anymore.